This is the Lifestances Podcast, and I'm your host, Lori Beaman. In this podcast, we're exploring life stances in a world of religious change. Life stances are what we think about the world, how we live and act within it, and how we relate to other people, other animals, and the environment. With an increasing number of people identifying as non-religious, this podcast explores how religious change impacts society. In the coming months, we'll look at weddings, funerals, palliative care, charitable giving and volunteering, forest burials, and other topics related to the changing religious landscape. I hope you'll join us. Many of us love to walk and hike. Exercise, socializing, and time with nature are some of the reasons we walk, hike, and trek. Some of us enjoy being alone, some of us walk with friends, family, walking partners, or hiking groups. In this episode, we'll explore the practice of walking, hiking, and trekking. Now, this might seem like a strange way to think about religion and non-religion in society, but as we'll see, hiking can actually tell us a lot about how people understand the world around them, their relationships with others, and their most deeply held values. We'll hear from Ryan Cragun, a professor of sociology at the University of Tampa, about the Nonreligion in a Complex Future project's research on walkers, hikers, and trekkers, and what this tells us about their life stances. Historian Hollis tells us about the history of human encounters with mountains. And finally, we'll talk with Executive Director of Atheists United, Evan Clark, who tells us about his group's trekking adventures. Over the past 2 years, the Nonreligion in a Complex Future project has conducted a study of hikers and walkers in 8 different countries: Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, Finland, Norway, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Through a survey of thousands of hikers and walkers and over 100 interviews, we asked hikers and walkers questions about ethics, values, and relationships. Here's Ryan Cragun to tell us a bit more about the study and its findings.
When you start asking people questions about their interactions with nature, right, writ large, and we don't necessarily have to define nature, all sorts of really interesting information about what they believe, what they do, what they think comes out, and we end up getting a good sense of like their morality, their values, like what matters to them, how they interact with nature. All of this is actually really reflective of life stances. And when we start digging into their interactions in nature and their experiences in nature, all of that really kind of just blossoms. It comes out without having to directly ask about it, which is kind of amazing.
Ryan mentioned the term life stances. And, well, you'll have noticed that this is the name of our podcast. So before we go further, we'd like to explore a little bit about what exactly are life stances. I asked Ryan to explain.
Now, we're not the first ones to use it. It's been around for a while, but we're kind of redefining it and developing it in a way that it reflects our understanding of what's going on. So it does include beliefs. Beliefs are obviously important, but it also includes what people do, often because we do things without knowing what's driving that. And those actions can reflect beliefs or values. And then it's also the relationships that people have. And this comes from Doug Ezzy in particular, right? But I think, Lori, you also argued pretty compellingly for this, that our relationships are also a reflection of our beliefs and our values and what we do. So all of those become kind of this really nice package when we're thinking about life stances, that it reflects who we really are and our positionality vis-a-vis nature and the world and the universe, and helps us kind of understand that substantive content that was missing from the study of the non-religious for quite a while.
So what do the surveys and interviews tell us about life stances, and in particular about religion and non-religion?
If we're looking at things like attitudes towards the environment, okay, our survey participants do include a lot of religious people and non-religious people. And one of the things that we find is it's not like religious people are pro-pollution and pro-destruction of the environment, right? Like we just don't see that. So we're not seeing huge differences in how people want to treat the environment. We see some differences in how people conceptualize nature, and I'll get into that. But as far as like some of the bigger level issues that people might think exist out there, there's actually not a big difference in terms of like, hey, I want to be out in nature and I want to spend time with, animals and plants and things like that. That's true regardless of whether you're religious or not. Where we start to see some of the differences is in conceptualizations of nature and the relationship between humans and nature. And I don't want to make this out as like it's massive differences, but there are meaningful differences between the religious and non-religious and how they think about nature and how they're kind of positioning humans relative to nature. So one of the big ones that we see is that among the non-religious, they're more likely to put humans and nature on a level playing field. Instead of among the religious, we see that they're more likely to put humans above the rest of nature and suggest that we're stewards, right? So it's not like anybody saying, hey, we get to exploit nature, we get to destroy it. They're more like, hey, we should take care of it. Whereas the non-religious are like, you know what? Nature has just as much of a right to exist as we do. We're lucky to be here, okay? And it's not like massive differences, and we don't know necessarily all the consequences of that. So we're going to be unpacking that, I think, as we go along. But it is an important conceptual difference to think about how people are placing themselves relative to nature, how they're thinking about nature. I think that's probably one of the biggest and most important findings that we have from this data is just the different ways that people are beginning to conceptualize nature. And it could be that the shuffling off of religion, right? So losing that religious shell has opened up new ways for people to think about their relationship with nature. We think that's what's going on. We can't say that definitively, but we think that's actually opening up new ways to think about humans' relationship to nature, which is kind of a fun finding.
Part of this new relationship with nature is a growing recognition of the harms humans have caused to the world around us and to our fellow terrestrials. Now, terrestrial might seem like a bit of an odd term, but it's a word that was used by sociologist Bruno Latour, who wanted to describe how to dismantle the human-animal hierarchy that has largely characterized how we imagine our place in the world as humans. In other words, Latour was trying to challenge human superiority. In the survey, we asked people to write a letter to nature. Ryan describes what people had to say to nature in those letters.
They wrote these really nice letters to nature. And immediately, and this was true in all the countries we did this, right? We did word clouds. The number one word that comes up in all of them is sorry, right? They're apologetic. They're apologizing for humans' impact on nature. Now, we get a lot of other stuff in there as well, right? So a lot of people are talking about beautiful and wonder and awe and all of those things. But really, the fact that sorry comes out as number one is kind of amazing, right? That at some level, we all recognize the consequences that we as humans have on nature, whatever that is, and we feel bad about it. Now, to what extent that's going to change our behaviors, that's a whole different question.
One additional finding surrounds questions of awe and wonder. People sometimes understand these feelings as being religious experiences, and for some people, they are. But our research suggests that this feeling of awe and wonder is not necessarily related to the transcendent.
So we get really amazing stories. I'm thinking of one that was somebody that I interviewed. She was talking about hiking in the Grand Canyon. It was a guided group, but the guide took them somewhere that most people don't get to go. And it was kind of down a cliff in the Grand Canyon, but they were completely isolated. And they had camped, so they'd set up camp. And then at night, they went, and it wasn't that far, it's another few hundred yards from their campsite. And they were able to look out over a cliff. There's no light pollution. So that it's just this beautiful view of the stars. You get a real view of what the sky actually looks like without all that light pollution. And she was just overwhelmed. She's like, the awe that I felt. And at some level, it also makes you feel small, right? And that's okay. But there's a connection with the smallness of humans and the vastness of space and the universe that exists. And that's just one of hundreds, probably thousands of stories of awe that we get from people who are not religious. So there's nothing inherently religious about experiencing awe or wonder. I like to flip that around and say, that's actually a human experience.
If we are seeing a new kind of relationship with nature emerging, what are the implications of this for the future?
So if we were to see over the next, I don't know, let's just make up a number, 50 years, that more and more people become non-religious and they start shifting their life stances to these more egalitarian ways of thinking about humans and nature, what are the consequences for, say, climate change? What are the consequences for our ways of thinking about the environment? And it's always tricky to say like protecting the environment, but like setting aside land that is protected land that we don't get to develop, right? So are we just going to be extracting more resources, or are we going to say, you know what, we need to maintain a viable ecosystem where we're not losing all of these different species? And I could see that happening, right? If more and more people adopt this more egalitarian way of thinking about nature, it's very possible that the ways that we interact with nature, both at the micro level, but also at the meso and macro level, start to shift in meaningful ways. And maybe we begin to worry more. I mean, this is going to sound weird, right? But there's a very anthropocentric way of thinking about climate change. There's like, oh, this is going to hurt humans. And we ignore the fact that it's going to hurt everything, right? Like it's the consequences of climate change are not just for us. Sure, I live really close to the sea and like it's going to cause me to have to move. But what about all the other things that live here, right? And I don't think we're as focused on those questions right now. And maybe this transition will help us realize this is actually a much bigger issue. What are the consequences of our behavior on the whole human environment and world environment, right? They're much bigger questions. And hopefully this recognition will start leading down that path.
In order to understand human relationships with nature, it's important to think not only about the present, but also about the past. Here we turn to Dawn Hollis, a historian and author of Mountains Before Mountaineering, The Call of the Peaks Before the Modern Age. In her book, she describes how people in the 16 and 1700s understood and experienced mountains. Through Dawn's work, we can see a long-term shift happening in attitudes toward nature over the past 500 years or so. In this time, there's a change from understanding nature entirely as the work of God to opening the possibility of seeing nature outside of a purely religious framework.
For me, the big story from 1500 to today is this kind of, I think, a shift. So in the period that I was so interested in, it was taken for granted that God made nature. If you're a European in the 16th or 17th century, you look at nature as the book of nature. It is another form of revelation from God. It's another way that God is telling humans what they should be doing, how he thinks, it's unquestioned. And then towards the end of the 17th century, you start to get this gradual dawning of this idea of deep time. The realization that actually the world probably wasn't made in a literal 7 days, that the world isn't literally 5,000 years old, that it is older than that, and that Genesis can't be interpreted literally, and that is a hugely destabilizing thought. I think that what the big story is that before 1700-ish, you appreciate a mountain because it was something that was created by God, and that's part of your world, your whole worldview. After the sort of start of the 18th century, mid-18th century, you don't have to link it to religious belief. You still can. A lot of people who write about the sublime still do link it to religious belief. But you also then get people who don't and who can say, well, mountains kind of fill us with this feeling of inspiration. And that's because we have the human intellect to appreciate it. And so for me, that's that big narrative, is that kind of shift from religious relationship.
We see that over time, understanding nature as separate from any kind of divine act of creation was becoming more and more possible. Turning to the social level, Dawn explains how in the past, human interaction with mountains was just part of everyday life.
I think what kind of really struck me throughout my research, and also in talking to other researchers looking at sort of even earlier periods, is the extent to which kind of hiking or the act of going to a mountain is kind of interwoven into just the fabric of existence to some extent. I think that there's this essential difference. I always think about the fact that, like in the Alps, you've got mountains that have tunnels drilled through them so that you don't have to, for convenience, to get from A to B, you go through the mountain. But in the early modern period, if you wanted to get to the next valley, you went over the mountain pass in between you. That was just going over the mountain through the. That was part of the texture of your daily life. If you were a traveler in the early modern period, you either go by sea or you go across land. You hike, you use horses, and you often have to go over the terrain. And if you're a farmer in the Alps in the 17th century, your whole year, if you're a farmer in the Highlands in Scotland, your whole year is defined by the movement from the lower pastures to the upper pastures. So that was a big part of my book, was looking at what I called the real mountaineers, and that was what the term meant in the 17th century, is the people who lived in the mountains. And so in the summer, if you had herds of cattle and you also had crops, to stop them eating the crops and to take them somewhere where there was richer pasturage, you would take them up into the mountains. And in all of the mountainous regions of Europe, they do this. They take the herds up into the mountains. So you've got different words for all of the different, like you've got the Boolies in Ireland, the Sheelings in Scotland, the Alpages in the Alps, and in all these different locations, there are traditions associated with the taking of the movement up into the upper pastures. So we have ethnographic accounts from the later stages of the Sheelings in Scotland, which sort of like talk about it as a great time of like celebration. You're going up there and everyone has a party, and then a lot of people some people come back down and others stay up there, and then when you go to take everyone back down, the whole village goes back up, has another party, comes back down, and whilst they're up there, they're making whiskey, they're collecting the things that they need to make dyes for clothing. They're making they're making cheeses from the milk that the cows are producing.
As Dawn notes, in the early modern period, mountains were busy places.
This idea that we have that a mountain is this big empty space for you to go and plant a flag on top of, or to kind of like hike through and find yourself because you're sort of all on your own, isn't reflected in the sort of stuff that I read about. The mountain passes are busy places. There's this wonderful account of this one guy who's like climbing over a mountain pass, and he hears like the rattle of the cowbells, and he talks to a lady climbing past him, and there's it's like a bustling thoroughfare, and you find all these ruined buildings in the mountains nowadays, and they're sort of romantic and eerie, but they weren't once. They had families in them, and they had life, and they had people people and their animals, and the animals who weren't theirs, all sort of intermingling with the mountain, which I think is kind of again is a huge shift to today, where the mountain is a place that we go to and it is apart from us. And there might be some interesting different animals there and different plants, but they're very separate from our normal life. And for me, that is kind of what I think is really interesting about the shift into modernity, is that we now talk about hiking and mountaineering and trekking and trail walking, and they're all these things that we see as like extras, like special things that we do. It's something which is separate from our daily lives, because we've kind of cut ourselves off from nature in a lot of ways, I think. And so to some extent, it almost is kind of such a big shift in category. I sometimes almost find it hard to talk about what's going on in the early modern period in relation to today, because it's like, well, would they have said I'm a hiker or a mountaineer or a climber? No, but they were hiking and mountaineering and climbing. It was just something they did all the time. If people lived in mountains, they're in the mountains. People traveling have to go through mountains. And I think people were much more embedded in nature because they had to be.
We asked Dawn to reflect on where humans are now in our relationship with mountains and nature.
I think we're in a really weird place, actually, with our relationship with mountains and with the environment in general, where we simultaneously kind of value and almost sometimes fetishize it, whilst also not really protecting it. Like, I think there's a real, irony to sort of mountaineering or hiking or climbing and being seen as this kind of, a lot of people view it as an expression of love for the environment, but the activity on a mass scale is damaging to those environments. From the beginnings of modern mountaineering onwards, you kind of seem to get this desire to set nature up as a challenge against humans. So, being the first to summit Mont Blanc is a challenge. Being the first to summit Mount Everest is a challenge. But the challenges are running out, of being the first, And so new challenges have to be made. So it's like, the first person to climb all 7 summits, the fastest, but this is by which I mean the seven highest summits in all the continents. And then that's been done. So be the fastest. And of course, what do you have to do to be the fastest? You have to fly helicopters halfway up Everest, and that, it's so egregiously unfriendly to the environment that is supposedly inspiring this kind of activity. So I think there's this real sort of it's something that I've kind of wrestled with myself, because I love these environments, and it's sort of like, how do we continue to enjoy nature without destroying it? If you're not lucky, if you don't live near mountains, you have to travel to get to them if you want to climb them, and traveling to get to them is going to be at a cost to the environment. So I think I think we're at this point where a lot of people are kind of wrestling with that. Whilst also some people are blatantly not wrestling with that and are just carrying on doing what strike me as these greatly self-indulgent excesses. And so I think we're at a bit of a junction, and I don't know which way we're going to turn.
As Ryan explained earlier, awe need not be the unique experience of the religious. We talked with Evan Clark, the Executive Director of Atheists United based in Los Angeles. He describes the Atheist Adventures program that his group runs.
Atheist Adventures is a project to bring atheist communities on epic camping trips. There was this idea we had years ago around what is a religious experience for the non-religious. I've met plenty of religious people who talk about these experiences where they're just overwhelmed by something and they feel it in their bones, and it makes them both more committed to their beliefs and their identity, but also their community. And as a non-religious person, as a secular person, as a naturalist, I explain that as something physiological going on in the body. And so the question is, how do you trigger that? How do you create that same level of meaning making for a non-religious person? And nature always came up as the best answer for us. So when we started discussing ways we could provide that, meet that need in our community, we started thinking about what is the most epic camping trip we could provide for people. And that turned into Atheist Adventures.
We asked Evan about the role of awe and wonder in the adventure trips. He describes the first trip the group did, which was to Death Valley National Park.
Something about Death Valley, if you've ever visited Death Valley National Park, it's the largest national park in the lower 48 United States. And it has a sense of epicness and awe. When you're in it, you feel so small. I think in the way that you feel small when you look at the Milky Way galaxy. And we wanted to take that and put it on hyperdrive. And so we said, let's not just go to Death Valley National Park. Let's go there on a moonless night with an astronomer and do a star talk in the middle of Death Valley National Park. And that became the backbone of this trip. We also add all these great hikes and help you explore the park, and we camp together around the campfire. But how do we create that moment where you're going to think back 10 years from now and go, that was unbelievable. I was filled with awe and wonder. Because I think our best moments and memories in life often are those moments where you feel overwhelmed by a sense of awe or wonder. And those can be replicated. We can create those. Some people create those in a lab with drugs, and we can create it in a national park with a scientist under a moonless night.
Evan told us that a typical trip would have about 20 to 40 people, generally with diverse ages and genders. Evan's group, Atheists United, is trying to build communities through these hiking experiences.
For us, we're trying to build communities. That's the mission of our organization. And so for us, we want you to feel something in a space that is safe and connected to other people. There's tons of research that shows that you will live longer, you're happier, you'll donate more to charity, you'll get more involved in your government if you are active in a community. And so the idea of taking this experience of awe or wonder, this idea of feeling existentially connected to the universe, and doing it with other people should broaden your sense of what's capable because you're not alone in that experience. And so I love after that star talk, when you're sitting under a perfect Milky Way sky in the pitch black, and you can turn to someone next to you and go, did you feel that too? And that's the beauty, I think, of what we provide.
As Evan says, the experience of being in nature seems to change how people think of their relationships to other people, non-human animals, and the environment.
I think we have a lot of opportunity from a secular perspective to recognize our connectedness to all other species in the ecosystem we exist in, right? Like the second you let go of the idea that there are gods or supernatural elements that break the laws of physics, suddenly all we have is the naturalistic world around us, right? You look around, you use the scientific method and try to measure the world, and the only thing that's obvious is that we live in an ecosystem. And because you live in an ecosystem, the logical conclusion is every action you take has consequences on everything else around you. You can't separate yourself from the ecosystem you live in. And if we're to truly internalize that, then we are ethically bound by everything around us, by our environment, by all the other people and animals that we share a planet with, share a universe with, possibly, if we're able to connect with those someday. And I think the ethical implications of that are incredibly powerful. I think the mental strain of trying to meet those ethical demands are incredible. And I don't know how I would ever navigate it without a community. So I really like the challenge. I think there's opportunity through projects like these camping trips to reconnect with nature and other animals and species, and have appreciation for the ecosystem we live in that I don't always feel in the built world of Los Angeles when sitting in traffic for 45 minutes a day, the impact I have. But when I see a California condor in Pinnacles National Park, like we did on our last trip, these birds that have 9-foot wingspans and had to be reintroduced by humans because we had killed them all, almost all of them. They got down to, I think, 20 birds left on the planet, and we had to work so diligently to try to bring them back into the world. I don't know. I think you can have a better sense of our impact and our ability to exist with other species. But I don't know. From a secular perspective, we're most obviously just cousins to all of these animals, right? Like there is no other explanation. Evolutionary process has led to us being literal cousins to all other species and all other humans. And so the question isn't whether we're connected. The question is what we should do about it.
We asked Evan about his thoughts on where humanity is headed.
I have to see hope. I have to think that there is opportunities for non-authoritarian systems to be the norm. I've been speaking for a few years now about how I think the biggest tension between atheist and religious communities is not actually theism versus atheism. It is authoritarianism versus pluralism. I think it's the model in which you build community and teach ideas. And, atheists are fully capable of being Nazis, and Christians are fully capable of being egalitarian hippies. And we actually can come together around shared values rather than shared beliefs to build a more equitable and accessible world. But, I think the question still is begged, is the human brain at the scale of society, when now there's billions of people on the planet rather than just a tribe or two, can we move beyond what is now the tribes of our time, which is the nation state? Can we move beyond our communities and the nation states and suddenly feel that all humans in all places on the planet, regardless of gender or race or orientation or size or wealth or you name it, can they be truly equal to you? And can I extend my empathy and compassion for them at the same level that I would my own family? And that is a test humanity has not passed yet, outside of a few small examples. But we've shown capacity to. And that's what excites me. I do think that's why there's hope.
It seems as though we're in a time of change regarding humans' relationships to nature. In a way, this change has been happening over the centuries. We heard from Don Hollis that a process over hundreds of years led humans to understand nature outside of an explicitly religious framework, not necessarily divinely created. At the same time, as Don noted, people in the past were in some ways connected to nature more deeply, with their lives dependent on the ebb and flow of the seasons. While many people love to explore nature, Don pointed out the paradox of this, in that our wish to traverse this planet's most beautiful and fascinating areas can actually be harmful to the environment. We're also seeing a contemporary shift. Some people are seeing the human relationship with nature not as a hierarchy with humans at the top, but with humans as simply one part of nature. With this in mind, as we heard from Ryan, some people are expressing deep regret for how humans have treated nature and want to repair that relationship. Nature offers the possibility to build community, as Evan discussed, but also to deepen the sense of interconnectedness between humans, non-human animals, and the natural world. As Evan noted, however, the realization that humans exist as part of a larger ecosystem still leaves the hard question of, what now? And the answer to that is especially important given the current climate crisis. We hope you'll join us for the next episode as we continue to explore our changing life stances.